Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and happy Victober. Today I'm going to be having a look back on the previous 9 Victobers and picking out my favourite books. So if you don't know what Victober is, it is a month-long readathon that is all about celebrating Victorian literature. I will leave my announcement video and the announcement video of the other 9 hosts we have this year down below if you want to find out more about it. But Victober starts today on the 1st of October and I'm very excited for it. I have lots of wonderful Victorian reading planned. But I thought today, as it's the 1st of Victober, the 1st of October when you're seeing this, it might be fun to look back on the previous 9 Victobers and what I read in those previous 9 Victobers. Because as I said, this year is the 10th of October, which is very, very exciting. I can't believe it's been going for so long. So I thought I would take a look back on what I read in previous years and sort of talk about some of my favourite books from previous Victobers and work out like which was the best Victober, I guess. I do have quite a lot of books to mention in this video, so I probably won't give you too much detail about each of them, but hopefully it'll still be a kind of interesting exercise. So we're going to go all the way back to 2016, which was the first year of Victober. I do realise this is the 10th of October, but that doesn't mean it's 10 years since Victober started. It's 9 years since Victober started because the Victobers like bookend the years. So Victober number 1 was 2016 and then Victober number 10 is 2025. So it is actually 9 years since Victober began, but it's the 10th Victober. So back in Victober 2016, I read many things. I read Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope. It Was Snowing Butterflies by Charles Darwin, which was a little Penguin Black classic. Mrs. Warren's Profession, a play by George Bernard Shaw. The Half Sisters by Geraldine Jewsbury. Carmilla by J. Sheridan and Fanu. New Grub Street by George Gissing. The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Modern Love by George Meredith, poetry collection. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which was a reread. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which might have been a reread as well. Maybe not, I can't remember. And A Study in Scarlet, also by Arthur Conan Doyle. So of those books, I would say that there are like 3 new favourites from that selection. The Half Sisters, New Grub Street and The Woodlanders are great favourites of mine, and 2016 was the first year that I read those 3. David Copperfield was a reread for me, but one I absolutely loved. And in fact, if I recall correctly, I had a really, really good reread of David Copperfield in 2016. A reread that like shot David Copperfield like up in my estimation. So those would be my favourite like 3 new to me books and favourite 1 reread from 2016. But I would also like to recommend Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu and The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, both of which are fantastic too. If I had to pick one favourite from 2016, it would probably have to be The Half Sisters by Geraldine Jewsbury, which is a incredible Victorian novel about 2 sisters. One is the legitimate daughter of their father and the other is the illegitimate daughter of their father. They don't know about each other's existence for a really long time, and we follow their lives. The legitimate sister living in her sort of traditional middle-class life, and the illegitimate sister living a more unconventional life and becoming an actress. And just the way this book looks at the position of women in the Victorian period is fantastic. I have reread it since and I love it a lot. Then in 2017, again, I read many Victorian books. I read The Rebecca Rioter by Amy Dillwyn, Drama in Muslin by George Moore, Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë, which was a reread, The Odd Women by George Gissing, Uncle Silas by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot, which is my least favourite book ever. Probably. So that, you know, brings that Victober down. Miss Marjoribanks by Margaret Oliphant, Ghostly Tales, which is an anthology of ghost stories. The Two Destinies by Will He Collins. Actually, I hate The Two Destinies as well. This was a bad Victober. Yeah, The Mill and the Floss and The Two Destinies are 2 of my least favourite Victorian books, 2 of my least favourite books of all time. Both made me exceptionally angry. So yeah, anyway, and then I also read The Life of Charlotte Brontë by Elizabeth Gaskell and The Uncommercial Traveller by Charles Dickens, which is a non-fiction book. In fact, both of those 2 are non-fiction books, obviously. The Life of Charlotte Brontë is a biography. So I know what my least favourite books in that Victober were, because The Mill and the Floss and The Two Destinies are two books I would not recommend. Wilkie Collins is a very hit or miss author for me, and The Two Destinies was a big miss, and George Eliot is not hugely for me, and The Mill and the Floss sums up all the reasons why. Anyway, we don't need to get into a tangent about why I hate The Mill and the Floss here. Let's talk about my favourite books from 2017. There's obviously Wuthering Heights, which was a reread for me and is one of my favourite books of all time. I would also highly recommend the Rebecca Rioter and Drama in Muslin, both of which are great. But I think my favourite books from Victober 2017 would have to be The Odd Women by George Gissing and Uncle Silas by Jerry Sheridan Le Fanu, both of which are fantastic. Which is my favourite? Probably The Odd Women by George Gissing, which is a wonderful proto-feminist novel which looks really fascinatingly at the position of unmarried women in the late Victorian period. But I do really love Uncle Silas by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, which is a really gripping gothic novel about a young girl called Maud and all of the strange things she goes through. And Uncle Silas is one of those books where I feel like when I read it, I didn't necessarily give it a huge star rating or think this is a new favourite, but it is one of the Victorian books I think about the most and that I recommend the most. And I really, really want to reread it because I feel like when I reread it, it will become an all-time favourite. Probably I do love The Odd Women more at present, but I have read this twice, and I feel like once I've read Uncle Silas twice, then my love for it will just be even greater. Okay, so that was 2017. Let's look at 2018. This was a good Victober. I read Poor Miss Finch by Wilkie Collins, When Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerard Manley Hopkins, short poetry collection, Dr. Marigold by Charles Dickens, short story, The Cricket on the Hearth by Charles Dickens, which is a Christmas novella, Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells, Zoe by Geraldine Jewsbury, Off-Street Pieman by Henry Mayhew, which is extracts from his book London Labour and the London Poor, Olive by Dinah Mullet-Craik, Kim by Rudyard Kipling, Garth Owen by Alan Rain, Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, which was a reread, East Lynne by Ellen Wood, Three Men on a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, and Dr. Wurtle's School by Anthony Trollope. That was an excellent Victober. So Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell is, again, an all-time favourite of mine. So that was definitely one of my favourite things I read that Victober. But there were some other great things in there too. Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells is a fantastic, really interesting book, and one of H.G. Wells's realist works rather than his science fiction. I love it a lot. East Lynne by Ellen Wood is an incredible sensation novel. And then Dr. Wurtle's School by Anthony Trollope is a wonderful Anthony Trollope book, one of my favourites of his. A really interesting sort of moral dilemma story about a school and what happens when the headmaster discovers a secret about one of his teachers. And then I also read Olive in 2018, and Olive remains a real favourite Victorian novel of mine. It is the coming-of-age story of a young girl who has scoliosis, how she deals with the prejudices that she faces because of this, and how she takes her life in her own direction. And it's just wonderful. If you like Jane Eyre, read Olive. I really want to reread Olive actually, because I've only read it once and I love it so much, but I do feel like a reread would enhance that even more. So yeah, there we go. That was 2018. So then 2019, I've got some great books here as well. I read The Diaries of Hannah Culwick, which were some Victorian diaries by a maidservant. Flatland by Edwin Abbott. That was less of a hit for me. I didn't love Flatland, but there we go. Fascinating, but not fun. I read News from Nowhere by William Morris, The Light That Failed by Rudyard Kipling, The Gate of 100 Sorrows by Rudyard Kipling. That was a short story collection, I think. Then I reread a bunch of Oscar Wilde. I reread The Importance of Being Earnest and A Woman of No Importance, both of which are plays, and I also reread The Picture of Dorian Gray. I then read The American Senator by Anthony Trollope and John Halifax Gentleman by Dinah Mullet-Craik. I also read Alex Forbes of Howglen by George MacDonald and Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau, and I reread Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. So yes, another good Victober. Some great rereads this Victober in 2019. Dombey and Son is an all-time favourite of mine, and A Woman of No Importance is one of my favourite Victorian plays, probably my favourite Victorian play. I also love The Picture of Dorian Gray so much. I would also highly recommend The American Senator by Anthony Trollope. Really interesting Anthony Trollope novel. Lots of really interesting characters and complex love stories and exploration of class. And I'd also very much recommend John Halifax Gentleman by Dinah Mullet-Craik, which is a coming-of-age story, a sort of dual coming-of-age story about two friends, Phineas and John Halifax. John Halifax comes from a very impoverished background and he wants to become a gentleman, and this book is following him on his ambition to do that, but it's all told from the perspective of his friend Phineas, and it's just great. However, I think my favourite book from Victober 2019 is probably Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau, which is a wonderful novel about two sisters moving to a new small town, about the gossip and scandal that ends up following them, and about their lives, and it's so richly developed and so fascinating. And Harriet Martineau was a sociologist. Like, she wrote a lot of books about sociology and the study of people as well, and you can really tell that from the novel. It's just a novel that has such a great understanding of people, and it's fascinating. Okay, Victober 2020, another great Victober. Got some really good books in here. So I read Green Fern Farm by Richard Jefferies, The Children of the New Forest by Frederick Marryat, Michael Armstrong the Factory Boy by Francis Trollope, Armadale by Wilkie Collins, Lady Anna by Anthony Trollope, The Romance of the Shop by Amy Levy, Mugby Junction by Charles Dickens, The Fairy Tales of Oscar Wilde, Mrs. Seacole's Adventures in Many Lands by Mary Seacole, which is a memoir, The Great Exhibition of 1851, which is a source book, so a book full of primary sources from the Victorian period. And then I reread Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë, The Half Sisters by Geraldine Jewsbury, Shirley by Charlotte Brontë, and Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Presumably I had started Little Dorrit before October. That is a lot of books that I read in Victober 2020, some of which are quite long. I guess this was during the COVID lockdowns when we weren't allowed outside, but still, that's a lot of books. So I did reread some wonderful books in Victober 2020. The Half Sisters I've already mentioned, I reread in 2020 and loved that. And then Wuthering Heights, another favourite, and Little Dorrit, both of which are favourite books of all time for me. So always a good Victober when you reread them. And then I would highly, highly recommend Michael Armstrong, The Factory Boy by Francis Trollope. Really interesting industrial novel. And I really enjoyed Mrs. Seacole's Adventures in Many Lands, which is just a really interesting memoir. To pick a favourite from Victober 2020 is quite tricky. I love Armadale by Wilkie Collins a lot. I had a really good reading experience of that. And as I said, Wilkie Collins is sometimes a bit hit or miss for me, but Armadale was definitely a hit. I found it fascinating. I also love Lady Anna by Anthony Trollope, which is a wonderful, interesting sort of love triangle, complex class dynamics story by Anthony Trollope. But I think my favourite book from Victober 2020 would probably have to be The Romance of a Shop, which is a really interesting sort of new woman novel about some sisters who open a photography shop in order to support themselves in the late Victorian period. And I just really, really love this book and find it historically fascinating. Okay, we're into Victober 2021. And in Victober 2021, I read Barry Lyndon by William Makepeace Thackeray and Basil by Wilkie Collins. Not a great start to Victober. I don't really like either of those two books. Then I also read The Beetle by Richard Marsh, The Frozen Deep by Wilkie Collins, the novel adaptation that Wilkie Collins wrote of the play he wrote with Dickens, not the play he wrote with Dickens, though I should read that sometime. The Semi-Detached House by Emily Eden, American Notes by Charles Dickens, which is a work of non-fiction, A Shropshire Lad by A. Housman, work of poetry. That was a reread. The Wheels of Chance by H.G. Wells, Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell, short story collections, some of which were rereads, I think. The Heir of Redcliffe by Charlotte Mary Young, The House by the Churchyard by Jerry Sheridan and the Fanu, and The Vicar of Bullhampton by Anthony Trollope. And what were my favourite books from 2021? So I really enjoyed rereading A Shropshire Lad. I had read them before, but I listened to them, I believe, in 2021 and really enjoyed that. And then I would really highly recommend The Beetle by Richard Marsh, which is a really interesting late Victorian horror novel, which is fascinating. And one I've thought about a lot since, and one that would be kind of fascinating to study. But when it comes to my favourite book from Victober 2021, it would have to be either The House by the Churchyard by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, which is a interesting historical novel with sort of sensation elements and a lot of drama, or The Vicar of Bullhampton by Anthony Trollope, which is a wonderful, wonderful Anthony Trollope book. You know what, actually, I love The Vicar of Bullhampton more than The House by the Churchyard. And The Vicar of Bullhampton tells a story of a vicar and various things happening around him. There is a love triangle plot, there is a church politics plot, there is a crime plot, and there's just so much going on, and it's great. I can't believe that I read these books 4 years ago. This feels very recent to me. I think it's partly because I moved to where I live now in very, very late 2020. So anything I've read from like 2021 onwards, I read here, and therefore it doesn't feel like it was very long ago. Whereas like the books I read before 2020, I didn't read in the place I live now, so they feel like they were a long time ago. But yeah, did I really read The Vicar of Bullhampton in 2021? Oh dear, time is stressful. Okay, 2022, I reread The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy and The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Then I also read, for the first time, Hide and Seek by Wilkie Collins, The Semi-Attached Couple by Emily Eden, Marianne Withers by Geraldine Jewsbury, A Noble Life by Dinah Mullock-Craik, The Young Pretenders by Edith Henrietta Fowler, The Three Clerks by Anthony Trollope, then Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and The Ring and the Book by Robert Browning, both of which are novels told in verse. And then I read lots of short stories. So I read the short story collection Keynote and Discord by George Egerton, some stories from A Dark Night's Work and Other Stories by Elizabeth Gaskell, some stories from Wood and Tony by Lucy Clifford, some stories from Women Who Did, which is a anthology with lots of different stories in, some short stories from the Victorian Short Fiction Project, which is an online archive, and The Old Governess's Tale, which is a short story by Dinah Mullock-Craik. So I reread two favourites. I love The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins and The Mayor of Casterbridge a lot. I think they're both fantastic books. And then of the new to me reads, I guess I would highly recommend Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, a really interesting buildings roman told in verse. And I'd also recommend one particular short story I read in 2020, which was from the Woman Who Did collection. It's a short story by Thomas Hardy called An Imaginative Woman, and it's fantastic. I would really recommend that story. But I think my favourite read from Victober 2022 has to be The Three Clerks by Anthony Trollope, which I just really, really enjoyed. It's a really, really fun story about three clerks in the civil service and the trouble they get into about money and love, and one of them wants to be a novelist, and it's just really, really fun and really delightful and has all the like Trollope warmth that I love. So I love that one a lot. Okay, 2023. Which really doesn't feel like 2 years ago. In my mind, I read these a year ago, not 2 years ago. Anyway, I read a lot of great things in 2023. I read Night and Morning by Edward Bulwer Lytton, In Memoriam by Alfred Lord Tennyson, a long poem, Goblin Market and Other Poems by Christina Rossetti, Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins, The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, An Eye for an Eye by Anthony Trollope, A Burglary by Amy Dillwyn, Afternoon by Ouida, that's a play, A Struggle for Fame by Charlotte Riddell, Miss Meredith by Amy Levy, In Darkest London by Margaret Harkness, My Flirtations by Ella Hepworth Dixon, Charlie's Aunt by Brandon Thomas, that's another play, as is Condida by George Bernard Shaw. And then I also read Eve's Ransom by George Gissing and The Beth book by Sarah Grand. What a Victober 2023 was. That's a lot of books and a lot of fantastic books. So there were two rereads in there that I absolutely loved. Goblin Market and Other Poems by Christina Rossetti and The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. The Way We Live Now is one of my all-time favourite books. That was our group read for 2023, and we had a really, really good discussion, and just a lot of people loved it, which just made me so happy because I love Anthony Trollope so much, so that was great. And then of my highly recommended books from that year, I would really recommend Night and Morning by Edward Bulwer Lytton. Interesting buildings roman, all about class and the Victorian obsession with legitimacy. I'd also really recommend A Burglary by Amy Dillwyn. I love Amy Dillwyn, and this is a really fantastic novel by her. I'd also recommend the play Charlie's Aunt by Brandon Thomas, which is hilarious, and My Flirtations by Ella Hepworth Dixon, which is a really, really delightful series of vignettes all about the narrator's various flirtations with various men, and it's just great fun. But when it comes to an absolute favourite book from 2023, I'm genuinely struggling to pick from 4 books. That's how good of October 2023 was. So there's Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins, which was a fantastic Wilkie Collins book, really, really top tier, so dramatic, so pacey, just an incredible book. I also loved An Eye for an Eye by Anthony Trollope, which is quite a different Anthony Trollope. It's much pacier and darker than some of his books, and it worked really, really well. It's not as cozy as Anthony Trollope usually is. And then I also loved A Struggle for Fame by Charlotte Riddell, which is a fascinating book about two Irish writers who come over to London in order to try and make it on the literary scene, and we follow their lives. And it's just a really fascinating takedown of the Victorian publishing industry. I loved that book so much. I have a copy of it somewhere, and I don't know where because my bookshelves are in quite a lot of disarray at the moment because I need another bookshelf. And then also another favourite from 2023 was The Beth book by Sarah Grand, which is just an amazing Bildungsroman and an amazing critique of Victorian patriarchal society, following the character of Beth from her birth to her adulthood, looking at the struggle she goes through and looking at how her mind develops and how she becomes the person she is. And it's so good. I think the Beth book is probably my favourite book I read in Victober 2023. But it was a really good Victober. So that is a hard pick. Moving on to Victober 2024, which was good, but not as good as Victober 2023. So in Victober 2024, I read quite a lot of things, but some of them were short stories and plays. So I read The Doctor's Wife by Meredith Elizabeth Braddon, Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle, that was a reread, The Modern Millionaire and Other Stories by Oscar Wilde, I think some of them are rereads, The Lifted Veil by George Eliot, that's a short story, The Haunted House, which is a short story collection by Dickens and various other authors, The Fate of Fenella, which is a novel written by a lot of different authors in collaboration. Then I read a bunch of plays, Trelawney of the Weald by Arthur Wynne Pinheiro, Charlie's Aunt by Brandon Thomas, London Assurance by Dion Boucicault, and The Ticket of Leave Man by Tom Taylor. Then I also reread Lois the Witch by Elizabeth Gaskell, and I read The Lancashire Witches by William Harrison Ainsworth. I then also read The Perpetual Curate by Margaret Oliphant, Linda Tressel by Anthony Trollope, Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope, and Ayala's Angel by Anthony Trollope, and I also reread The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens. So 2024 was a good Victober, but it definitely wasn't as good as Victober 2023. And in Victober 2024, I reread two great things. I reread Charlie's Aunt, which I really loved, as I mentioned already, and I also reread The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens. And this was an especially great reread because I hadn't read The Mystery of Edwin Drood since I was 18, so it had been 13 years, I guess. Yes, that's the correct maths. It had been quite a long time since I last read The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and I had forgotten just how amazing it was. And rereading it last October was just it was so amazing. I feel so deeply sad that Charles Dickens didn't manage to finish The Mystery of Edwin Drood because it was his last novel that was left unfinished at his death. And the last novel he finished before The Mystery of Edwin Drood was Our Mutual Friend, which is my favourite novel of all time. And I genuinely think that if Dickens had finished The Mystery of Edwin Drood, that might have been my favourite book of all time. That is how good I think it could have been. But he didn't finish it, and it's tragic. Anyway, I also would really highly recommend the play Trelawney of the Wells by Arthur Wynne Pinheiro, which is really fun. It's about an actress who is engaged to someone from outside of the acting world, and all the kind of tensions between the theatrical people and the non-theatrical people. It's great fun. I would also recommend The Perpetual Curate by Margaret Oliphant. Really interesting novel, lots of small town drama and church politics and discussion of scandal. It's really great. One of her Carlingford Chronicles. And then in terms of what my favourite book from Victober 2024 is, it would probably be a fight between two Anthony Trollope novels, Linda Tressel and Ayala's Angel. Well, I say that. I think Ayala's Angel is my favourite in terms of the sheer enjoyment I got out of that book. It's just so delightful. It's about two sisters and their romantic relationships, and it's just full of Anthony Trollope joy, as well as having lots of unrequited love stories and class and money troubles and all the stuff you expect in an Anthony Trollope novel. It's just pure delight from start to finish. And Linda Tressel is not pure delight from start to finish. It is one of the darkest Anthony Trollope novels in some ways, and it is about a young woman, Linda Tressel, and her aunt wants her to marry an older man who she doesn't want to marry. And the book is basically 200 pages of Linda's aunt and this man trying to bully Linda into marrying him, and it's so horrible, but it's fantastic. I think it's a really impactful critique on the lack of power women had in 19th century society, So it's not like a cheerful Anthony Trollope like Isla's Angel, but it is really, really good, and I would highly recommend it. So those would be my favourite 2 books from Victober 2024. So there we go. Those are the previous 9 Victobers. I wonder what will be my favourite books that I read this Victober. I'm very excited to see. I feel like looking back on my Victobers, I'm really impressed by how much I've managed to read every Victober. I feel like I'm not going to be reading that quantity of books this Victober, but we will see. In terms of what the best Victober has been, so I marked up and counted like how many favourite rereads I had, how many like highly recommended ones I had, and how many like proper favourites I had in each year. And the 2 years with the most like newly read favourites were 2018 and 2023, where I had like 4 new favourites each, like 4 books that I was struggling to decide which was my favourite. But in terms of the years where I had like the most favourites overall, where like I had lots of new to me favourites and also lots of like highly recommended and lots of reread favourites, 2020 is in second place with 8 favourites, but 2023 takes the crown as the best Victober so far with 10 favourites. And looking back on Victober 2023, like I read some fantastic books that year. I don't think Victober 2025 is going to be as glorious as Victober 2023 because I'm not going to manage to read that many things. But what a Victober. Okay, this has been a bit of a rambly video, but I hope this has been interesting and fun and useful, and I thought it might be a fun thing to do kind of on the first day of the 10th Victober, to look back on the previous 9 Victobers and the books that I have read. So yeah, that is all for now. Do let me know down in the comments what is your favourite book you've ever read during Victober. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.